Knowledge Products presents the United States Constitution, narrated by Walter Cronkite. This is the first of 2 tapes on the Constitutional Convention, and the first of an 8-tape series on the U.S. Constitution.
Philadelphia would long remember the evening of May 13th, 1787. Cannons roared, bells clanged, and citizens cheered as a carriage rolled into town, escorted by the flashing sabers of the city cavalry. General George Washington had arrived. The carriage proceeded to the corner of Fifth and Market Streets, where Washington was to lodge in the boarding rooms of Mary House. But Mrs. House, who had been busy cleaning and scouring, would be disappointed. After stepping out of his carriage, Washington was greeted by his friend Robert Morris, former superintendent of finance and reputedly the nation's richest man. Morris persuaded Washington to stay with him instead, so the carriage rumbled a little farther up Market Street to an elegant 3-story mansion. Here Washington would remain for 4 months until the Federal Convention completed its business in mid-September. Washington was one of 7 delegates sent by Virginia to the Federal Convention, and his presence was sure to lend dignity and credibility to this solemn gathering. William Pierce, a delegate from Georgia, described the 55-year-old hero with typical reverence.
General Washington is well known as the commander-in-chief of the late American Army. Having conducted these states to independence and peace, he now appears to assist in framing a government to make the people happy. Like Gustavus Vassa, he may be said to be the deliverer of his country. Like Peter the Great, he appears as the politician and statesman. And, like Cincinnatus, he returned to his farm perfectly contented with being only a plain citizen, after enjoying the highest honor of the Confederacy, and now only seeks for the approbation of his countrymen by being virtuous and useful.
18th century America was a vast country where transportation was slow and expensive. From South Carolina, you could travel as quickly to England as to Boston. London newspapers reached Savannah faster than mail sent overland from Massachusetts or Connecticut. Understandably, Washington did not relish the 150-mile, 4-day trip to Philadelphia. His journey was easy, however, compared to the 800-mile trip endured by 2 of Georgia's delegates. Washington had his doubts about attending the convention. He suffered from acute rheumatism that sometimes required him to carry one arm in a sling. His brother had recently died, and his mother and sister were ill. Most importantly, when Washington resigned his military commission in December 1783, he told Congress he was taking his leave of all the employments of public life. How would Americans react if the retired commander-in-chief went back on his word and re-entered public life? And how would Washington's reputation fare if the Federal Convention fell apart in dissension and disgrace? John Jay, future Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, counseled Washington not to attend the convention. Why? Because the convention, Jay feared, violated the Articles of Confederation, the law of the land, and Washington's sterling reputation might tarnish if he sanctioned this illegal assembly. Another friend cautioned that the convention would probably fail. Even James Madison, who urged Washington to attend, had reservations. Perhaps Washington should arrive late, Madison advised. That way, if the convention disintegrated in the first few days, Washington would not be implicated. It ought not to be wished, Madison remarked, that General Washington should participate in any abortive undertaking. Despite these warnings, Washington showed up. He showed up on time, and he attended every session of the convention. This made him a bit unusual among delegates. Of 74 delegates named by 12 states, only 55 attended. And of these 55 delegates, only 30 to 40 were on the convention floor during an average day. The convention was scheduled to begin on Monday, May 14th, the day after Washington's arrival. But when Washington entered the East Room of the State House, now called Independence Hall, he joined a sparse gathering of delegations from only 2 states, Virginia and Pennsylvania. There was little to do except renew acquaintances, gossip, and wait. Monday's highlight was the dramatic entrance of Pennsylvania's celebrated savant and tamer of lightning, Benjamin Franklin. 81 and infirm, Franklin was carried into the East Room in a sedan chair on the shoulders of convicts. Washington and others trekked to the State House at 6th and Chestnut for another 9 days before a quorum of 7 delegations was finally mustered. Then, on Friday, May 25th, the Federal Convention got underway. George Washington was a figure of legendary proportions, even in 1787, but he had little influence on the convention floor. As president of the convention, Washington did not participate in debates, but he was a commanding presence, perched atop a dais where he could gaze down at delegates. When the general spoke, in or out of the convention, everyone listened. And when Washington remarked on the need for a strong central government, even if such a government was disliked by the people, one delegate remembered his words over a decade later.
It is too probable that no plan we propose will be adopted. Perhaps another dreadful conflict is to be sustained. If, to please the people, we offer what we ourselves disapprove, how can we afterwards defend our work? Let us raise a standard to which the wise and honest can repair. The event is in the hand of God.
George Washington was not exactly the statue of marble chiseled by American storytellers. He enjoyed a good off-color joke as much as the next man, but his public demeanor was aloof and dignified, and this enabled him to invoke terror with a mere look of disapproval. A popular anecdote about Washington, which may or may not be authentic, illustrates the point. During a break at the convention, the New York delegate Alexander Hamilton remarked, "General Washington is reserved and aristocratical even to his intimate friends, and allows no one to be familiar with him." A Pennsylvania delegate, Gouverneur Morris, a man of wit and charm, replied that he could be as familiar with Washington as with any of his other friends. Hamilton, an aide to Washington during the Revolution, was skeptical. He issued a challenge to Morris. "If you will, at the next reception evening, gently slap him on the shoulder and say, 'My dear General, how happy I am to see you look so well.'" Morris accepted the dare, whereupon, according to one account, Washington stepped back and fixed his eye on Morris for several minutes with an angry frown until Morris retreated abashed and sought refuge in the crowd. Morris later said, "I have won the bet, but dearly paid for it, and nothing could induce me to repeat it." If Washington, upon arriving in Philadelphia, had stuck to his plan to room with Mrs. House, he would have shared this residence with another distinguished Virginian and future president, James Madison. Often dubbed Father of the Constitution, Madison was far less famous than Washington, but far more important to the Federal Convention. Madison, a rare blend of scholar and statesman, had labored for years to bring about a strong national government. He was convinced the Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781, were incapable of solving the political and economic problems besetting post-war America. Years after the Philadelphia Convention, Madison became a foe of centralized government and a champion of states' rights, but the Madison of 1787 was a different breed of political animal. This James Madison, distrustful of state governments, wanted states to be subordinately useful to the national government. As Madison said in a letter to Washington, written shortly before the convention,
"Conceiving that an individual independence of the states is utterly irreconcilable with their aggregate sovereignty, and that a consolidation of the whole into one simple republic would be as inexpedient as it is unattainable, I have sought for middle ground, which may at once support a due supremacy of the national authority, and not exclude the local authorities wherever they can be subordinately useful."
Madison, father of the Constitution, did not write the final document. That distinction belongs to the previously mentioned Gouverneur Morris, the man who slapped Washington on the back and paid the price. But Madison struggled long and hard to bring about the convention, and he was the principal architect of the Virginia Plan, the most influential proposal at the Federal Convention. The Virginia Plan outlined a new constitution for America. It set the tone for the entire convention and greatly influenced the final document. The final Constitution displeased Madison in several ways. For example, he stood firm on proportional representation in both branches of the legislature, whereas the Constitution provides for equal representation of states in the Senate. And suspicious of state legislatures, Madison crusaded for a national legislature with power to veto state laws. This provision, had it passed, probably would have embarrassed Madison in later life when he defended states' rights. But this legislative veto was regarded as essential by Madison in his earlier years. Nevertheless, if anyone deserves to be called Father of the Constitution, it is James Madison. A bookworm and political activist who usually dressed in black, Madison has been aptly characterized as a single-minded political monk. Georgia's William Pierce described James Madison during the convention.
Mr. Madison is a character who has long been in public life, and what is very remarkable, every person seems to acknowledge his greatness. He blends together the profound politician with the scholar. In the management of every great question, he evidently took the lead in the convention, and though he cannot be called an orator, he is a most agreeable, eloquent, and convincing speaker. From a spirit of industry and application which he possesses in a most eminent degree, he always comes forward the best informed man of any point in debate. The affairs of the United States he perhaps has the most correct knowledge of any man in the Union. He has been twice a member of Congress, and was always thought one of the ablest members that ever sat in that council. Mr. Madison is about 37 years of age, a gentleman of great modesty, with a remarkable sweet temper. He is easy and unreserved among acquaintances, and has a most agreeable style of conversation.
James Madison was in Philadelphia 11 days early, the first out-of-state delegate to arrive. He'd been preparing for months, organizing his thoughts and writing letters. Congress in most states had instructed delegates to revise and correct the Articles of Confederation. But Madison had greater ambitions. For him, nothing less than a new Constitution would suffice for an America embroiled in crisis. In a letter to Thomas Jefferson, Madison remarked,
"What may be the result of this political experiment cannot be foreseen. The difficulties which present themselves are on one side almost sufficient to dismay the most sanguine, whilst on the other side the most timid are compelled to encounter them by the mortal diseases of the existing condition. These diseases need not be pointed out to you who so well understand them. Suffice it to say that they are at present marked by symptoms which are truly alarming, which have tainted the faith of the most orthodox Republicans, and which challenge from the votaries of liberty every concession in favor of stable government not infringing fundamental principles, as the only security against an opposite extreme of our present situation."
What were these mortal diseases of which Madison spoke? They were economic and political problems dating from the American Revolution. Foremost among these problems, Madison believed, were the absence of taxing power in the central government and its inability to stop the emission of paper money by individual states. To finance the war with England, Congress and individual states printed paper scrip. When this caused runaway inflation, Congress stopped the presses and started borrowing instead. Thus, when peace arrived, Congress faced staggering debts, but the Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781, denied to Congress any taxing power to pay off these debts. Congress could only requisition states for money, with no power to enforce these requisitions. In addition, a number of states continued to print money in peacetime, thereby fueling inflation and defrauding creditors. Late in life, Madison summarized the major problems confronting America between the end of the American Revolution in 1781 and the ratification of the Constitution in 1788. Historians often refer to these years as the critical period of American history.
The radical infirmity of the Articles of Confederation was the dependence of Congress on the voluntary and simultaneous compliance with its requisitions by so many independent communities, each consulting more or less its particular interests and convenience, and distrusting the compliance of others. Whilst the paper emissions of Congress continued to circulate, they were employed as a sinew of war like gold and silver. When that ceased to be the case, and the fatal defect of the political system was felt in its alarming force, the war was merely kept alive and brought to a successful conclusion by such foreign aids and temporary expedients as could be applied. A hope prevailing with many and a wish with all that a state of peace and the sources of prosperity opened by it would give to the Confederacy in practice the efficiency which had been inferred from its theory.
The end of the war, Madison argued, did not bring political and economic stability in its wake. Various state governments proved unequal to the task.
The close of the war, however, brought no cure for the public embarrassments. The states, relieved from the pressure of foreign danger and flushed with the enjoyment of independent and sovereign power, instead of a diminished disposition to part with it, persevered in emissions and in measures incompatible with their relations to the federal government, and with those among themselves.
Madison and many other Americans desired a stronger central government, a government with teeth, especially a government with the power to tax. In the words of another nationalist, Alexander Hamilton, "He who controls the power of the purse must rule absolutely." The goal of the Federal Convention, Madison believed, should be to establish a central government with powers far greater than authorized by the Articles of Confederation. Madison urged his fellow Virginians to arrive early in Philadelphia so they could plan their strategy, but he found himself alone for 10 days with little to do except discuss tobacco prices with a local merchant. On May 14th, the scheduled opening of the convention, 4 Virginians were present: James Madison, George Washington, George Wythe, and John Blair. 2 days later, Governor Randolph and Dr. James McClurg arrived, and the next day, George Mason, celebrated author of the Virginia Bill of Rights. With the convention postponed for 11 days, the Virginians had time to plan. Philadelphia had 117 inns, and it was in one of these, the Indian Queen Tavern, that strategy sessions were held. After conferring among themselves, the Virginians would meet at dinner time, 3 p.m., with the Pennsylvania contingent, the stronghold of nationalist sentiment. From these pre-convention meetings emerged the Virginia Plan, a working draft with many features that would find their way into the United States Constitution. As Madison recalled,
On the arrival of the Virginia deputies at Philadelphia, it occurred to them that from the early and prominent part taken by that state in bringing about the convention, some initiative step might be expected from them. The resolutions introduced by Governor Randolph were the result of a consultation on the subject, with an understanding that they left all the deputies entirely open to the lights of discussion, and free to concur in any alterations or modifications which their reflections and judgments might approve. The resolutions became the basis on which the proceedings of the convention commenced, and to the developments, variations, and modifications of which the plan of government proposed by the convention may be traced.
for entertainment, there was dinner at the home of Ben Franklin, providing Madison with his first opportunity to rub shoulders with the beloved sage. Franklin, writing to an English friend to thank him for a cask of beer, described this gathering of notables.
We have here at present what the French call une assemblée des notables, a convention composed of some of the principal people from the several states of our confederation. They did me the honor of dining with me last Wednesday, when the cask was broached and its contents met with the most cordial and universal approbation. In short, the company agreed unanimously that it was the best porter they had ever tasted.
The 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention were from the elite of American society: lawyers, members of Congress, state office holders, large-scale farmers, merchants, and physicians. Some first-rate minds were present: Virginia's James Madison, George Wythe, and George Mason; Pennsylvania's James Wilson and Benjamin Franklin; New York's Alexander Hamilton; Connecticut's Roger Sherman and William Johnson; New Jersey's William Patterson; Delaware's John Dickinson. The impressive slate of delegates was described by Thomas Jefferson as an assembly of demigods. Yet many important Americans were conspicuous by their absence. Virginia's Richard Henry Lee, who made the original resolution for American independence in the Second Continental Congress, refused to serve. His fellow Virginian, the great orator Patrick Henry, also refused to serve, because, in his words, he smelt a rat. Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams were abroad. The diplomat John Jay was not present, nor were two original firebrands of the American Revolution, John Hancock and Sam Adams. In addition, Rhode Island refused to send delegates to Philadelphia. Long a thorn in the side of nationalists, this maverick state was commonly viewed as a case study in democracy run amok. Especially despised was its willingness to print paper money to pay creditors, a kind of fraud in the eyes of James Madison and many other delegates. Some nationalists were relieved by Rhode Island's absence. Now they wouldn't have to deal with its contentious opponents of centralized government. One newspaper, the Massachusetts Sentinel, wrote,
12 states will be represented in the Grand Federal Convention now sitting in Philadelphia. Rhode Island is the delinquent state, but this is a circumstance far more joyous than grievous, for her delinquency will not be permitted to defeat the salutary object of this body. And her deputation, if, as is supposable, they should have been birds of a feather with the majority of her present administration, must have been the cause of much mortification to the illustrious characters who now compose that assembly, and must have reflected discredit on its proceedings.
During the struggle over ratification, some opponents of the Constitution, or anti-federalists as they were called, grew weary of being told they should approve the Constitution simply because of the extraordinary character and ability of its authors. Melancton Smith, a leading anti-federalist at New York's ratifying convention in 1788, argued that many groups of equal distinction could have been culled from American society.
I do not wish to detract from their merits, but I will venture to affirm that 20 assemblies of equal number might be collected, equally respectable both in point of ability, integrity, and patriotism. Some of the characters which compose it I revere. Others I consider as of small consequence. And a number are suspected of being great public defaulters, and who have been guilty of notorious peculation and fraud with regard to public property in the hour of distress.
Another anti-federalist, William Gowdy of North Carolina, also commented on the reputation of convention delegates.
It is said that those who formed this Constitution were great and good men. We do not dispute it. We also admit that great and learned people have adopted it. But I have a judgment of my own, and though not so well informed always as others, yet I will exert it when manifest danger presents itself.
There was a heavy downpour on Friday, May 25th, as the Federal Convention, with a quorum of 7 states present, commenced its business. The delegates presented their credentials. George Washington was unanimously elected president of the convention. A few other housekeeping details were disposed of, and delegates called it a day. Reconvening on Monday, the convention established procedural rules. One of these would prove especially important. Voting in the convention would be the same as voting in the Confederation Congress, 1 state, 1 vote, an equality of suffrage, as it was called. This rule did not sit well with Pennsylvania delegates, but the Virginians rightly believed small states, if not accorded this equality, might refuse to participate. The large states, Madison reported, agreed to wait and fight another day.
Previous to the arrival of a majority of the states, the rule by which they ought to vote in the convention had been made a subject of conversation among the members present. It was pressed by Gouverneur Morris, and favored by Robert Morris and others from Pennsylvania, that the large states should unite in firmly refusing to the small states an equal vote, as unreasonable, and as enabling the small states to negative every good system of government, which must, in the nature of things, be founded on a violation of that equality. The members from Virginia, conceiving that such an attempt might beget fatal altercations between the large and small states, and that it would be easier to prevail on the latter in the course of deliberations to give up their equality for the sake of an effective government, than, on taking the field of discussion, to disarm themselves of the right, and thereby throw themselves on the mercy of the larger states, discountenanced and stifled the project.
Additional rules were adopted the following day, including a demand for total secrecy of convention proceedings. This was to allow delegates to express their views freely, without the pressure of public reaction. Some spectators disliked this secrecy rule, and when Thomas Jefferson, minister to France, heard of it, he wrote to John Adams,
I am sorry they began their deliberations by so abominable a precedent as that of tying up the tongues of their members. Nothing can justify this example but the innocence of their intentions and ignorance of the value of public discussions. I have no doubt that all their other measures will be good and wise. It is really an assembly of demigods.
After disposing of formalities, delegates squared away for action. Several delegates took notes, but with one exception, these were sketchy and incomplete. Only James Madison kept a thorough record. He attended every session and undertook the exhausting job of transcription.
I chose a seat in front of the presiding member, with the other members on my right and left hands. In this favorable position for hearing all that passed, I noted in terms legible and in abbreviations and marks intelligible to myself what was read from the chair or spoken by the members, and losing not a moment unnecessarily between the adjournment and reassembling of the convention, I was enabled to write out my daily notes during the session, or within a few finishing days after its close, in the extent and form preserved, in my own hand, on my files.
Ironically, Americans had to wait 50 years to learn precisely what happened in the convention. On the final day, just before the Constitution was signed, delegates voted to keep the proceedings confidential. Why? Because some delegates feared folks back home might be unhappy with some of the candid opinions expressed in debates. By 1799, Madison was an ideological enemy of strong central government. He confessed to Jefferson that his convention record, if published, would lend aid and comfort to his political enemies. By 1821, Madison had served 2 terms as president and was revered as an oracle of states' rights. In that year, however, another convention note-taker, Robert Yates of New York, published his own account of the convention. Yates portrayed the young Madison as an energetic nationalist. Understandably, Madison was embarrassed. He accused Yates of exaggerating. 6 years later, Madison was encouraged to publish his journal to refute Yates. Madison still refused, explaining it would be indelicate to publish while 3 of the framers were still living. Madison, however, did arrange for the posthumous publication of his convention journal, altering a few passages here and there to tone down his early nationalism. Without Madison's journal, much of the convention's proceedings would be lost in a sea of ignorance. He left behind an invaluable record, one of the most important documents in American history. Since most of our presentation draws from Madison's journal, a few qualifications are in order. First, Madison transcribed in third person, using he instead of I. In quoting delegates, we have changed their speeches to first person. Second, Madison summarized and shortened many speeches, so it's difficult to know when we are listening to a verbatim account. Delegates disliked by Madison, such as Maryland's Attorney General Luther Martin, were especially vulnerable to this treatment. On one occasion, Martin, rumored to be drunk, droned on for hours. Madison covered this speech in a few paragraphs. Finally, Madison glossed over some emotionally charged exchanges, and his record, like Madison himself, was virtually bereft of humor. Now, using the source bequeathed to us by James Madison, let's turn to some major debates of the Constitutional Convention. In order to understand the evolution of the Constitution during convention debates, it is necessary to understand the first proposal submitted to the convention, the Virginia Plan. As we have seen, this plan was formulated by Virginia delegates, possibly with the aid of Pennsylvania delegates during pre-convention meetings. There can be little doubt that Madison was the driving force behind the Virginia Plan, since it includes key provisions suggested by him in earlier correspondence. The Virginia Plan, however, was submitted to the convention not by Madison, but by Edmund Randolph, governor of Virginia. Why was Randolph chosen for this honor? Well, possibly because, as governor, he was seen as the natural leader of the Virginia delegation, or possibly because, unlike Madison, Randolph was only a moderate nationalist, and the radical proposals of the Virginia Plan would seem more palatable from his lips. To appreciate the impact of the Virginia Plan, we must remember that many delegates saw their task as that prescribed by the Confederation Congress and by many state legislatures, to correct and expand the Articles of Confederation. The convention was expressly instructed to amend the Articles of Confederation, not to draft a new constitution. Today we refer to the Constitutional Convention, but this label was not used at the time. Instead, it usually was called the Federal Convention, or sometimes the Grand Convention. The Virginia Plan, as we shall see, was no mere enlargement or correction of the Articles of Confederation. It outlined a new Constitution. Introduced immediately as the convention got down to business, the Virginia Plan consumed the first 2 weeks of debate. In this way, it established an agenda for the entire convention and accustomed delegates to the idea of scrapping the Articles of Confederation for a new Constitution. Before the Virginia Plan was introduced, the convention resolved itself into a committee of the whole. This was a technical device, a parliamentary ruse. A committee of the whole meant that all delegates, instead of sitting as the convention, were sitting as members of a committee, which would eventually make recommendations to the convention. A committee of the whole permitted free exchange of ideas and non-binding votes. In this way, delegates could feel each other out and say what they really thought. Later, when the committee of the whole transformed back into the convention, the same subjects would be debated and voted on again. Nathaniel Gorham from Massachusetts was elected chairman, and while the committee sat, he, rather than Washington, presided. The Virginia Plan, expressed in 15 propositions, was laid before the Committee of the Whole on May 29th. Before presenting the plan, Edmund Randolph sketched the general features which a national government ought to possess.
The character of such a government ought to secure, first, against foreign invasion, secondly, against dissensions between members of the Union, or seditions in particular states, thirdly, to procure to the several states various blessings, of which an isolated situation was incapable. Fourthly, it should be able to defend itself against encroachment. And fifthly, to be paramount to the state constitutions.
Next, Randolph summarized the defects of the existing Confederation, all pertaining to insufficient power in the central government. This indictment, like the Virginia Plan itself, bears the unmistakable imprint of James Madison. Randolph, voicing Madison's criticism, was careful not to offend convention delegates who were involved in drafting and implementing the Articles of Confederation. This passage also summarizes the problems confronting post-war America, as seen by Madison and other nationalists.
In speaking of the defects of the Articles of Confederation, I profess a high respect for its authors, and consider them as having done all that patriots could do in the then infancy of the science of constitutions and of confederacies. When the inefficiency of requisitions was unknown, when no commercial discord had arisen among any states, when no rebellion had appeared, as in Massachusetts, when foreign debts had not become urgent, when the havoc of paper money had not been foreseen, when treaties had not been violated, perhaps nothing better could be obtained from the jealousy of the states with regard to their sovereignty.
Next, Randolph read the Virginia Plan, a clarion call to scrap the Articles of Confederation and to frame a new Constitution for America. In view of this, the first proposition voiced by Randolph was curiously deceptive.
Resolved, that the Articles of Confederation ought to be so corrected and enlarged as to accomplish the objects proposed by their institution, namely, common defense, security of liberty, and general welfare.
This proposition was never debated. As Gouverneur Morris observed, it contradicted the rest of the Virginia Plan, so why bother to debate it? Randolph agreed, and he introduced the following resolutions instead.
First, that a union of the states merely federal will not accomplish the objects proposed by the Articles of Confederation, namely, common defense, security of liberty, and general welfare. Secondly, that no treaty or treaties among the whole or part of the states as individuals would be sufficient. Thirdly, that a national government ought to be established consisting of a supreme legislative, executive, and judiciary.
When delegates spoke of a federal government, they meant a confederation of sovereign states, such as that established by the Articles of Confederation. When they spoke of a national government, they meant a government where sovereignty resides in a central authority, such as that eventually established by the United States Constitution, the supreme law of the land. Originally, Randolph moved to correct and enlarge the Articles of Confederation, which established a federal government. Now Randolph, without a murmur, declared that a federal government was inadequate and that a national government should be established instead. Clearly, a national government was the intent of the Virginia plan, but why this vacillation? Here is an all-convention business that went on behind the scenes. Some informed guesswork is necessary. According to one theory, Randolph's original call to correct and enlarge the Articles of Confederation was inserted in the Virginia plan to placate Randolph himself, who did not share Madison's more extreme nationalism. Randolph, we should mention, eventually refused to sign the finished Constitution because he feared it pushed too far into nationalism. According to this theory, when Morris pointed out the inconsistency of the first plank, Randolph capitulated and inserted 3 other resolutions, and these substitute resolutions may have been part of the original Virginia plan drafted by Madison. In any case, the first 2 of Randolph's substitute resolutions were passed over, and the Committee of the Whole focused on the third, that a national government ought to be established consisting of a supreme legislative, executive, and judiciary. Randolph was asked whether he wished to abolish state governments altogether. No, he said he had no such intention. Questions were raised concerning the difference between a federal government and a national government. Gouverneur Morris offered his opinion.
A federal government is a mere compact resting on the good faith of the parties. A national supreme government has a complete and compulsive operation. In all communities there must be one supreme power, and one only.
George Mason of Virginia, called by Madison the clearest reasoner he had ever heard, spoke up. A national government, said Mason, operates not on states, but directly on individuals.
Punishment cannot, in the nature of things, be executed on the states collectively, and therefore such a government is necessary as can directly operate on individuals, and will punish those only whose guilt requires it.
For many delegates, this became an important feature of national government and a bone of contention. If a national government is to operate directly on individuals, it must bypass state legislatures. The Virginia plan endorsed the national government, and this threat to state sovereignty raised some eyebrows. But for the time being, the Committee of the Whole approved Randolph's motion for a national government, and by implication, a new constitution. Then the committee proceeded to the second plank of the Virginia plan. Resolved, therefore, that the rights of suffrage in the national legislature ought to be proportioned to the quotas of contribution, or to the number of free inhabitants, as the one or the other rule may seem best in different cases. This hit a sensitive nerve that eventually threatened to kill the convention. How would voting, the right of suffrage, be apportioned in the national legislature? The Articles of Confederation placed each state on an equal footing. One state, one vote. The vote of a small state, such as New Hampshire, carried equal weight with that of a large state, such as Virginia. James Madison, James Wilson, and Gouverneur Morris regarded this equality of suffrage among states as manifestly unjust, but Madison was from Virginia, America's most populous state, while Wilson and Morris represented Pennsylvania, the second most populous state. During convention debates, as in all political conflicts, it can be difficult to pinpoint where a concern for justice ends and where a concern for self-interest begins. The Virginia plan called for the number of seats in the national legislature to be distributed according to the amount of taxes paid by states into national coffers, or by the number of their free inhabitants. This plank seemed to displease everyone. Even Georgia and the 2 Carolinas, frequent backers of nationalist measures, would never approve a scheme where slaves were excluded in figuring population. However, the famous or infamous slavery compromise, which counted a slave as 3/5 of a person, lay in the future. For now, a roadblock was thrown up by Delaware's George Reed, who warned of trouble to come.
I move that the whole clause relating to the point of representation be postponed. I remind the committee that the deputies from Delaware are restrained by their commission from assenting to any change of the rules of suffrage. And in case such a change should be fixed on, it might become their duty to retire from the convention.
With this threat, the convention looked as if it might stall before it got started. Pennsylvania's Gouverneur Morris responded.
The valuable assistance of the Delaware members cannot be lost without real concern, and so early a proof of discord in the convention as the secession of a state would add much to the regret. The change proposed, however, is so fundamental an article in a national government that it cannot be dispensed with.
Madison tried to appease the Delaware delegates. The convention, he reminded them, was sitting as a committee of the whole. The point was simply to find out where delegates stood. A vote in committee was non-binding and would not compel them to withdraw. Madison failed to convince. As delegates retired for the day, the delicate subject of representation was postponed, waiting in the wings to hurl the convention into its most serious crisis.
This is the end of Side 1. Please fast forward and turn over your cassette.